This video is brought to you by Brilliant. Across the world, economies are struggling with the lingering impacts of inflation and high interest rates. While there are tentative signs of relief in Europe and the US, where interest rates are expected to come down in the coming months, in much of the developing world, the economic instability of the past few years has apparently taken a more permanent toll. This is especially true in Africa, where high interest rates have crippled national budgets, triggering political instability and a slew of defaults. Things don't look likely to get better anytime soon either, both because a lot of African debt is due in the next few years, and because Africa's lenders, including both the West and China, are bickering amongst themselves about who gets what from the subsequent restructurings. So in this video, we're going to look at Africa's ongoing debt crisis, why it could get worse, and why it's become yet another point of tension between China and the West. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Now, the first thing to say is that, obviously, talking about Africa's debt crisis is a massive generalisation. And there are, of course, enormous intracontinental differences between different African economies. Nonetheless, African economies do seem to have been worst affected by rising interest rates, and there are some continuities between certain African countries when it comes to debt problems that we thought merited discussion. All in all, we don't mean to imply that Africa is just one big homogenous block, economically or otherwise, and hopefully we make that clear in the rest of the video. Anyway, disclaimers aside, let's get into Africa's debt crisis. Simply put, the rising interest rates we've seen across the world have put a massive strain on African public finances. African countries significantly increased their debt burdens in the 2010s, when interest rates were low and money was cheap, and national debt as a percentage of GDP across the continent rose from about 30% in 2010 to more like 55% today. While only about 40% of that debt was borrowed on the international markets, that's still quite a bit, and Africa has really struggled with the recent rise in interest rates, not least because international investors basically stopped lending to Africa last year. This meant that many African countries were unable to roll over their debt, which is when you pay off your loans with more borrowing. This might sound fiscally irresponsible, but it's common practice in developing economies where policymakers assume high levels of economic growth in the future. Anyway, Ethiopia, Ghana and Zambia have all defaulted on their debt in the past few years, and the World Bank estimates that a further 15 African countries are currently at risk of default. These include some of the biggest economies in Africa, like Egypt, which has just negotiated a $3 billion bailout loan with the IMF. Kenya, which has had a debt-to-GDP ratio approaching 70% and is currently in talks with both the African Development Bank and the World Bank for budgetary support, and Tunisia, which has a debt-to-GDP ratio around 90%, but has refused IMF support on the grounds that the austerity-like reforms required to unlock IMF support would stoke political unrest. Unfortunately, there's reasons to think that, unless the global economic outlook improves markedly sometime soon, things are only going to get worse, because a lot of Africa's bond payments are coming due between 2024 and 2032. For context, when a country borrows money, it usually does so via a bond. This is a bit of a simplification, but basically what happens when a country issues a bond is it says, if you lend me X amount of money for Y years, I'll pay you a little bit of interest every year for, and then after Y years, I'll pay back the full amount of X. For example, in 2014, Kenya issued a $2 billion 10-year bond. Every year since, Kenya has paid about $100 million to the holder of that bond. But this year, in 2024, 10 years after the bond was issued, they have to pay back the full $2 billion. In other words, the bond is coming due. Anyway, because African countries borrowed a lot of money in the late 2010s, often at 10-year maturities, they've now got to pay back a lot of money in the next few years. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, isn't this just what happens to weaker economies when interest rates go up? And well, that's sort of true, but a couple of factors have conspired to make things particularly difficult for Africa this time round. First, many low-income African economies rely heavily on exporting commodities like oil, metals or minerals, but unfortunately, weak global demand means commodity prices are low at the moment. Second, in some part thanks to climate change, harvests in certain African countries have been poor recently, which has increased food prices and stoked political instability. Third, weak tax revenues have caused Western countries to cut their aid budgets, and China, previously Africa's biggest creditor, has also significantly cut back on development aid and investment. But one of the underreported issues here is the fact that Africa's creditors can no longer agree on what happens in the event of a default. In the past, most sovereign debt was issued by Western countries and big institutions like the World Bank. So when a country defaulted, they would come together via a forum called the Paris Club and agree on who got what, i.e. a restructuring. Unfortunately for many African countries, sovereign lending today is a lot more complicated. Countries now also borrow off a whole load of other creditors, including Western financials, China, and its complicated web of state-owned enterprises, and more recently Gulf states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who've stepped in to fill the gap left by post-pandemic decline in Chinese foreign investment. While this means more cash for African countries, it also means that restructuring is really difficult, because China and the other new creditors aren't in the Paris Club, and they don't get on well enough to quickly come to an agreement. Zambia is a good case in point here. Zambia defaulted way back in November 2020, but China and the Western creditors, including a whole load of private financials, are still yet to agree on a comprehensive restructuring plan, in part because China wants sovereign creditors like itself to get more money than private Western companies. Unfortunately, prolonged restructurings are generally bad news for the global economy, because they basically mean that countries like Zambia have to just sit it out on the sidelines until it's done. Now, it's important not to overstate the severity of this crisis. The Economist reckons that 12 of the world's 20 fastest growing economies will be in Africa this year, and recent international bond issuances by countries like Benin and Côte d'Ivoire have actually been oversubscribed, which suggests that there's renewed demand for African debt. Nonetheless, it's still a precarious situation, and if interest rates stay high, the African economy could be in real trouble. A lot of stuff that we talk about at TLDR News can seem pretty complicated, especially when we dive into economics and detailed data, which is why we use Brilliant.org to keep us sharp. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. Brilliant is a learning platform designed to be uniquely effective. Their first principles approach helps you build understanding from the ground up, which is also how we structure TLDR videos. Each lesson is filled with hands-on problem solving that lets you play with concepts, a method proven to be 6 times more effective than just watching lectures. Plus, all content on Brilliant is crafted by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers, and professionals from MIT, Caltech, Duke, Microsoft, Google, and more. Brilliant helps build your critical thinking skills through problem solving, not memorizing. So, while you're building real knowledge on specific topics, you'll also be becoming a better thinker. Learning a little every day is one of the most important things you can do, both for your personal and professional growth. Brilliant helps you build real knowledge in minutes a day, with fun lessons you can do whenever you have time. It's the opposite of mindless scrolling. Brilliant recently launched a ton of new content in data, all of which uses real-world data to train you to see trends and make better informed decisions, something politicians could really learn from. Anyway, these are for learners of any level to start or continue learning data analysis, with a fully built-out suite of new content, from Bayes' theorem to multiple linear regression. And you can truly learn by doing, as you'll be working with real datasets from sources like Starbucks, Twitter, Spotify, and more. To try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, click on the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Brilliant for their support of TLDR News.